Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Dr. Nicolai Petro, a professor for political science at the University of Rhode Island. Nicolai is my go-to expert when it comes to the domestic politics of Ukraine and Russia. So, Nicolai, welcome back.
Nice to be with you again, Pascal.
Very glad having you again. We exchanged a couple of emails, and in one of them, you told me that your recent observation is that we might be underestimating the money factor and the economic factor in the way that now the war seems to be developing against, under any reading, against the interest of Kyiv. Can you maybe explain what you think we haven't looked at enough at the moment?
Right. So the Ukrainian government has a budget for 26, and one of the things that it projects is a budget deficit, but unfortunately, that budget deficit, from the perspective of the International Monetary Fund, which supervises the Ukrainian budget and tries to bring its expectations into line with the what Western financial institutions are able to offer to support Ukraine society and the Ukrainian war effort, is short by, I guess, roughly 30 billion euro, well, $30 billion. And, but that money, well, that's the gap. That's the gap that exists. And the gap is problematic because Europe has not projected for covering that expense. And the Ukrainian government hasn't considered what to do if that money is not forthcoming. So literally, the Ukrainian media is full of speculations about where the money will be cut, because nothing is being funded abundantly in Ukraine, including the military. So the numbers vary in the tens of billions. So I'm going to use a ballpark figure that was offered by financial analyst Timothy Ash, who said that if you take the sum of money that Ukraine will probably need over the next year and a half, it's likely to be around $100 billion, in addition to what has already been allocated, which I think is at a higher rate of spending than has actually been the case to date. Because I think at the latest EU meeting, the number that was mentioned in the communique that Europe has spent so far was either 167 or 177 billion. So that's for the past three and a half years. So the next year and a half at 100 billion, well, it's not a savings. It's not a reduction in any case. But Ash goes further to suggest that is, as he puts it, just to keep Ukraine in the game, just to keep it on life support. If there is to be any desire for Ukrainian victory, that number would have to be increased by 50%. So 150 billion, he thinks, would be a realistic projection for Ukraine that could possibly go on the offensive against Russia. So we see the numbers are getting wider and wider apart. And this leads me to the pessimistic, although I suppose you could say optimistic, if you are looking for an end to the war, But the reality seems to be that in addition to running out of personnel, running out of population, because of the numbers of people that are immigrating, or I guess a common figure is 500,000 a year leaving Ukraine. The number of absent without leave and desertions at the front, which are nearing 30-40% of the people nominally in the Ukrainian armed forces now. In addition to those problems, we now have the added problem of a lack of funding for the continuation of the war. And since Ukraine is already dependent on Western aid for no less than 50% of its war effort and 50% of its basic upkeep, its daily, its current accounts to pay all the things that are needed to keep the country going. It doesn't look like there's much of an opportunity to continue the war. I mean, everything is pointing to the impossibility of continuing this war effort. And this is one of the more unexpected ones. I would add that there's a solution to this problem, which is why Timothy Axe wrote it, which is that, look, there's a big fat golden egg in Europe. 300 billion in assets, which are Russian sovereign funds. But the person managing those funds, Belgian Foreign Minister Bart de Wever, who is responsible, I guess, for Euroclear, which has the bulk of those funds, pointed out that it would be totally unprecedented to seize sovereign assets. He was very clear about this point, and I guess in the final analysis was able to convince his colleagues in the EU that it would be an impossibility to do this in any way, shape, or form that could be considered legal. And as a result, Ash's conclusion in his essay was that there is no option for Ukraine to continue the fight except to be given these assets. But without the assets, which European leaders seem to feel at this point cannot be touched legally, then again, who's going to pay for the war? We don't know.
Yeah, but this question, at some point, we need to get some also currency specialists on the line here, because money problems are always proxy problems for deeper lying issues. Because in theory, what prevents the Ukrainian parliament from creating a law that says that the Ukrainian national bank must buy the war bonds that parliament issues or that the government issues, right? I mean, in theory, you can if you have a sovereign currency, you can replenish yourself indefinitely, but that doesn't do you a lot of good if the goods that you need to buy are denominated in euros or US dollars. So,
well, and the problem here is an actual credit crunch. In other words, no one in the West wants to lend. I mean, they're happy to talk about it, as long as we all do it, but you talk to any of them individually and none of them wants to, because they understand that this money is irrecoverable. Yeah. And Europe is going through a very difficult fiscal crisis, also partly of its own making. Yeah. So in this context, it's very interesting to see juxtaposed to this real economic crisis that is being discussed specifically by financiers, politicians, and bankers. And on the other hand, the analysis offered by political pundits and military analysts about how Ukraine can win the war in British newspapers and elsewhere, without basically ignoring the financial problems of Ukraine entirely, as if they didn't exist in their universe, and secondarily highlighting the difficulties of the Russian economy, which, whatever one might say about them, there is a fair amount of uncertainty and in the type of analysis. In other words, it's a projection of where the Russian economy would go forward from here, and a good measure of the pessimism that one can read about the Russian economy in European newspapers is or relies on the unreliability of Russian statistics. In other words, they say, well, if we believe Russian statistics, things aren't that bad. But we won't believe Russian statistics, and therefore we will project something completely. We'll just make it up. We'll just project a bad scenario because that's what we want to see, a bad scenario. By any comparison, any systematic comparison of the Ukrainian economy with the Russian economy, well, the Russian economy is robust and healthy compared to any such in any such comparison.
But the Europeans are still dreaming of this war to end the way the First World War ended, when Germany internally, politically couldn't do it anymore, right? Public strife, strikes, and then although they were expanded and not a single soldier on their soil, they had to give up because they didn't have any more the means to continue the war. They are still dreaming that this scenario with Russia is just around the corner. One more wonder weapon, just one more, and the whole Russian house of cards is going to collapse in itself. For 3.5 years, they've been telling us that story, and they're still waiting for that.
Well, a blogger called Big Serge had an essay today in which he looked at the issue of the Wunderwaffen that Ukraine has, and really laid bare the problems with having, or I should say, delivering tomahawks to Ukraine in any significant numbers that could actually be used. As he points out, I think very astutely, the missiles are there, the launching systems are not, because the United States has just started building land-based launch systems.
Right, because they are usually used on the sea, the tomahawks.
That's right. They're used on the sea, and they've now believe they need a land capacity for these as well. But they have only started producing these since 2023, and of course, the first people in line to get these new weapons is the U.S. military itself, and they are backlogged in the number of delivery systems that they've been promised. In other words, they have not yet come to fruition. So essentially, Ukraine would have to be given priority over the deliveries to the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps, and I just can't see Trump doing anything of the kind.
And it's bizarre because the production quantities by Lockheed Martin and there's one more company, Raytheon, that produces these things. The quantities per year range between 50 to 90, not 50 to 90,000, 50 to 90 full stop. And the total stockpile that the Responsible Statecraft Quincy Institute kind of estimated last year to exist in total is somewhere around the mark of 4,000.
Yeah.
it's insane to believe that in any reasonable quantity that could impact the battlefield could be delivered to Ukraine. But the idea is not to deliver for the battlefield. It's in order to bomb Moscow and bomb them to the negotiating table, as the Europeans frame it.
Well, there's the thing. I guess military analysts seem to feel that this, like other individual weapons systems, are not going to make a difference to the outcome of the battlefield. The Russian strategy has been obvious for a long time. It is a war of attrition, and it is based on a very slow and gradual accumulation of resources that can then push forward essentially without needing substantial sudden replenishment. In other words, it builds a momentum and then rolls forward on its own, having enough resources to do the task that has been set for it. So one of the things that the pro-Ukrainian analysts feel is or hope for is that Russia's military machine might collapse under the burden of continuing this military production. And they point to the fact that Russia's military production in its budget is actually scheduled to decrease. But that makes sense if you have preloaded, it seems to me, the stockpile. In other words, everyone acknowledges in the West that I think Russian drone production exceeds by far that of NATO and Ukraine combined by almost an order of magnitude. So, of course, I think there's enough drones now. Russia probably has enough drones now, and we'll shift to other things. And one thing that isn't often noted, but in Russia's forthcoming budget, the actual spending on the military is slightly reduced. I like the way opponents of, or let's say supporters of Ukraine say, well, this is a very minimal sort of reduction. Yes, but it is a reduction. It is a reduction in a time of war, something that Ukraine and NATO aren't even contemplating. They're contemplating the exact opposite, which will only increase the burden on their economies, whereas Russia's economic burden from the war is bound to decrease.
This is fascinating, that in a time of like very serious war, Russia actually doesn't take this NATO approach, which is like we need more money, and then we find a problem to deploy the money to. It looks at what it needs and then creates a budget, and there you go.
Well, it may be. I mean, from a logistical perspective, an advantage of having a military, an economic system that is tightly integrated with the military. We talk about the United States being a military industrial complex, and it is. But there are so many private producers in America that the system is extremely complicated and takes an inordinate amount of time to fund. So the creation, funding, deployment of a weapons system can take a decade or more. And I think Russia's centralized top-down approach, like that of other more centralized economic and political systems, probably gives it an advantage in this regard.
Yes, and let's not forget that a lot of the money that goes into these NATO budgets actually also might be lost in artificially inflated balance sheets of these weapons production companies and security companies and so on, who know that if they increase the amount by 1 or 2 million, it will still be paid.
Right.
So,
Right.
But if we now go back and look at what this means for the war, and speculating out in the wild is not a good thing, but still we are at a point now where it seems to me, it feels like something is about to change. And you've already laid out how the budgetary situation points toward change that must come because it's not in the budget. And if it's not in the budget, it's not in the future. One of the last thing, in my view, that Ukraine will lose before things are really over is going to be attention. It seems to be losing money now, but the last thing will be attention. And it seems to me that we're seeing the buildup of a new center of attention in the Caribbean with Venezuela. Do you have any thoughts about this? What to me now looks like a handing over of the baton of war attention to a war which in the no way or thinkable circumstances is necessary for the United States national security.
Right. I think that the United States has essentially left this war to the Europeans.
Mm.
But then the question is, how do the Europeans get out of this war? For Trump, I guess it was easy enough to argue that this war is far away, not in America's interests. And if the countries that are most threatened nearby want to continue the war, he's talking about NATO in Europe, then they should feel free to do so. And that suffices in his mind to justify the withdrawal of the United States and the lack of interest. So that's probably a good thing for winding down the war. I think if you, politicians like to say that NATO politicians like to say that peace will be achieved through arms or through military buildup. That it seems to me the opposite is the case. If you want to deprive this military monster of life, you need to choke it. You need to deprive it of oxygen. So I think that's a good thing overall. But the question now in my mind is, what could lead European leaders and NATO leaders to a similar conclusion? I'm not sure. The landscape there is different. It's more complicated. Many leading political figures have too long a track record supporting Ukraine and supporting the war effort, and having invested their reputation in not so much the rebuilding of Ukraine, but especially the building up of NATO as a military force. Also, likely in anticipation of the collapse of Ukraine. So that is probably likely to continue for some of them. And I guess I would throw back the question at you to some extent. For the United States, I think you're completely right. We are out of this game for the foreseeable future. And the one or two things, this sanction here, this weapons system there, will not change the overall attitude of this administration and will not make a difference to the outcome of the war. But but Europe has to step up and double and redouble its military and financial support. And I don't see how it can afford to do that. But I don't see any other way out for it but to do that.
Well, if I was a neocon and if I looked at this scenario and I understood that A, we've lost the political will of MAGA and so on to be deeply involved in this, and B, the Europeans are too weak to do anything, and C, the Ukrainians are running out of Ukrainians, and the Russians still have the momentum as you're doing it. If we had the same analysis, but I was a neocon, what I would now argue for would be the Afghanization of Ukraine, of like, okay, let the Russians come, let them win on the battlefield, and then the resistance war from within, right? Let's force them to swallow Galicia. And once they have to do that, we just funnel these weapons through the porous borders and so on, the Kalashnikovs and whatnot. Sorry, the all of the weaponry, the small arms, and pinprick after pinprick after pinprick in the territory that they have to occupy. Now, how do you think the Russians will try to avert something like that? Because I've never seen any Russian arguing that we have to swallow the whole of Ukraine. That this whole scenario that the Europeans say is the goal is actually not the goal, right?
Right. Well,
how to not get Afghanized?
Pretty easily, reach the borders of the four oblasts plus Crimea, and fortify it and don't go forward. And in response to Ukrainian attacks on these territories or elsewhere, respond with devastating force. In other words, it's not a surprise to anyone in Ukraine, and is a source of some friction in the government, that the Ukrainian strategy of striking, let's say, oil refineries, yes, it damages and reduces the Russia's budget revenues, but Russia is wealthy enough that it has the resources to cover any kind of reduction for the foreseeable future. Well, for a number of years at least, just with its existing liquid assets, which, as I understand it, let me just look this up, are along the lines of 250 billion in liquidity in the banking sector.
Wow.
Dollars inside Russia. So I think that the Russian response to this will be to devastate Ukrainian infrastructure 10 times over. It's a very bad game for Ukraine to be playing for a long time. In other words, the Ukrainian bet on the collapse of the Russian will to fight, either through through some combination of economic sanctions and military strikes, and just the slowness of the advance of the Russian armed forces, has to occur in a fairly short amount of time. Otherwise, it becomes a long game again. And in the long game, as I see it, Ukraine has only bad cards. It will keep losing many more people than Russia fleeing the country. It will have no foreign investment, because no investor in his right mind is going to invest in that kind of uncertainty and dangerous environment. And without the prospect of increased funding, dramatically increased funding to support either the war effort or the government, money, as I said, is running out.
Right.
So the deadline for having this epiphany that will transform Russia and force it to realize that it will lose is a matter of months at the most. The figure that I've heard, which I think would coincide with the actual inability of Ukraine to pay its bills, would be March and April of 2026, the spring of 2026, at which point perhaps Donbass, both Donetsk and Lugansk, will be largely occupied.
So your prediction is not that Russia would go all the way to eastern Ukraine, but that they will stop? And what about Odessa? Western Ukraine. Do you think Russia would actually go to Odessa and try to connect Transnistria in Moldova in the end through a land bridge? Or, I mean, we are not military strategists, but
sure.
Do you think so?
Yeah, I mean, my expectation has been for a long time that if Russia succeeds in its stated military objectives, everything that it would pursue beyond that would be an effort to compel Ukraine to accept these borders, compel it to peace. In other words, without needing to attack Kyiv, Russia could, or without needing to attack Dnipropetrovsk formerly, it could, without needing to cut off, to take Odessa and cut off Ukraine off from the Black Sea, it could. And all of those, by the way, are objectives well short of entering the heartland of Western Ukraine, where which is the most nationalist segment of the country. So they could do many devastating things long before they would need to actually enter the heartland of Western Ukraine.
Right. So these are the military strategies also on the Russian side that we just cannot.
I think it's important for those who look at the situation to never divorce Russia's military strategy from its diplomatic strategy.
Right.
That's something that the West doesn't do very well. It seems to have a military strategy and a diplomatic strategy and an economic strategy, but they're not well coordinated with each other. And each one of them seems to have its own set of assumptions that in the best of all possible worlds maybe can coincide. But as we are now seeing the flaws in that strategy, the military strategy has collapsed. And I think George Beebe, the former CIA analyst, wrote a piece in The Responsible Statecraft, which I think is very good. And he said he pointed out that Ukraine's strategy now military strategy has given up on victory. The strategy now is to define a ceasefire as victory. Okay. So what happens then is that if a ceasefire is achieved, Ukraine will pat itself on the back and say, we have achieved military victory. Now we will pursue the long-term diplomatic strategy of continuing to pressure Russia through sanctions and things like that, which, again, is not likely to succeed because the only thing, I think, as you're rightly suggesting, the only thing keeping Ukraine in the Western news right now is the bombardments, the pictures that you can show. If the ceasefire, if a ceasefire is implemented, Ukraine will be forgotten quicker than Gaza.
Yeah,
even quicker than Gaza. And as we know from the prelude to what happened even on the eve of the Alaska summit, you will have scores of Western companies chomping at the bit to get back to Russia, which was their most profitable international market for so many years. And you're going to see a lot of that with Ukraine being in everyone's minds, pretty much, I think, and an afterthought. If I were a Ukrainian analyst, I would not be pushing a ceasefire because of that very point. I would worry that we would have a very difficult. We would thankfully have stopped the bloodshed, but I would evaluate our chances of recapturing our territories through some sort of long-term strategy is very low. But Russia, I think, has a good point in diplomatic history to make, which is that nations don't pursue negotiations in order to achieve a ceasefire. They pursue peace. And if a ceasefire comes along the way, it is usually linked to a concrete peace strategy or a timetable for achieving peace, because everyone understands that a ceasefire per se is not peace and is simply an invitation to continue the war at a later date. And that's not something that Russia is interested in. And really, as things are now, with Russia holding the upper hand on the military battlefield, it's not something that Russia needs to pursue. So it logically is pursuing its maximum objective, which is a peace settlement. So the military component of this peace settlement is in place. The economic component, I think, is coming into sight with Ukraine's insolvency in the next 6 months. And that leaves the diplomatic component, which I think will be the hardest for Europeans to swallow. But with the support, I imagine, of the Trump administration, that support being, we're not helping we don't want to get involved in this fight. We don't want to support the Ukrainian war effort. That's already a big push toward a diplomatic settlement for Europeans. They will have to find a way to respond to that sooner or later.
Yeah, I mean, any kind of settlement of proper working settlement will include a regime change on one level or another, either in Kyiv or in the capitals of Europe, or both.
Probably both, actually, now that I think of it. In Ukraine, I think it would be inappropriate to put the cart before the horse. In other words, I don't believe that Zelensky has to be removed first in order for a peace settlement, or at least negotiations, to bear fruit. But I think the outcome of any peace settlement will automatically be new elections. And in those new elections, it is very difficult at this point to imagine Zelensky coming out on top. But it's also very difficult to imagine who his successor might be. I know there are those who argue that the environment favors a military commander or someone who offers some sort of military credentials, both for national security or anything else. There is an equally compelling argument, however, made by a number of Ukrainian sociologists who say that people across the country in large numbers will be so sick of the war that the sight of a military uniform, especially in politics, will cause them to reject that candidate, reject that party, for fear that the war could be renewed. So I could see it going either way, and very difficult to anticipate who has the upper hand after a peace accord is reached.
Right. Can I ask you about Russia? Because one of the things that has baffled a lot of analysts here in the commentariat is that Vladimir Putin and also Sergei Lavrov were so conciliatory toward the American position and the flip-flopping and then ultimately, flipping the table on everything that has been reached in the negotiations since Alaska. And Putin and Lavrov have always have gone out of their way to use the American framing of the situation as, the European hawks who kind of are destroying everything. The Americans are not to blame. Donald Trump is a good guy. And a lot of people go like, why? Why are you doing that? Why are you keeping the charade alive? What's your view on that?
Well, why not? I mean, it doesn't cost them anything. You can blame Europe more heavily. Europe clearly is to blame. To some extent, they're playing the same game, Trump and Putin and Lavrov, aren't they? Because the person left holding the bag is Ukraine. Is Europe for both of them. So that suits them just fine. We should also remember that for Russia and America, there are larger issues even than Ukraine. There is the bilateral relationship between these two global powers, which involves interactions in many different regions on many different levels and with many third-party actors in which, such as China and India, Brazil, different regional conflicts, in which both countries can look forward to the assistance of the other country when it suits their mutual interest. None of this has anything to do with Ukraine.
True, but
it is Ukraine, and what Trump has done the biggest service, I should say, by saying, we don't really care very much because we're not the ones to blame. It's not my war, and therefore we're making it a European war. So whatever happens there, if all of Ukraine is swallowed up, if it's destroyed, whatever happens there, our hands, like Pontius Pilate, our hands are clear of this. Let it be on the heads of the Europeans. And Putin is grateful, I would say, for that recognition. And there's no need to upset Trump, because Trump didn't, as far as I can tell from the statements made by the White House, by the key actors in the White House, he didn't say there won't be a summit. He said, we'll have a summit when there is something to sign, which is, of course, exactly what Putin has always been saying. There should be a summit when there's something to sign. And by phrasing it in this way, Trump is tangentially including Zelensky. In other words, saying, if Zelensky wants to be part of the summit, he too has to come and be willing to sign.
Yeah, but I mean, one of the things that drives people like me and others who analyze this crazy is that
I'm going to be optimistic.
The idea for the summit came from Trump. He pitched it, right? Yes. And the Russians reluctantly said, we're going to think about it. And then he calls it off. And he says they're not willing. And then he also puts now sanctions on these Russian oil companies with a goal of putting pressure on India to stop buy oil. I mean, all of this is so unfriendly. And Russia still, as you say, is very cool-headed about it and says like, okay, fine, we go along with your framing. That's what creates the cognitive dissonance.
Yes and no. I mean, Russia has not conceded anything in its position. It has maintained its position. Everything that Trump has said, Putin can agree with and see as a clarification of the things that haven't yet been agreed to. I mean, he would have liked to say, we agreed to this, but now he's saying, well, they still need to be clarified with among other things, Ukraine itself. On the issue of sanctions, we have to be careful. We should not be journalists. Nothing, when a sanctions package is announced and targets are identified and the entire process is set in motion, we have to understand that at every step of the way, the individual components of the sanction and whether they will be applied to third parties, whether to what extent the United States will control or ask third parties in other countries to respect these sanctions. These are all decisions made ad hoc. They are not written into law. They are possibilities. And I think that's the area where Trump likes to play, where he has the legal authority, apparently, and he has sort of his powder is dry. He can implement them if he wants to, or do you the favor of not implementing them.
Right.
Again, we see this as a pattern in all of his sanctions negotiations or his tariff negotiations. It's a very typical pattern. And Putin called him out on that and said, yes, we know this strategy. We've seen it before. We know how to deal with it. And of course, the best way to deal with these sorts of flip-flops is precisely that, to say, I know what you're doing. I'm the level-headed one here, and we can see this through. I'm not worried.
Right. No, you're right. Actually, I mean, the pattern is he takes something out of his bag, a problem that never was a problem, says this is the main problem, and then says like if you want this to go away, now you need to talk to me. And then the Europeans, they're like, okay, how can we fulfill 150% of your expectations? And the Russians go like, no, and the Chinese usually also.
The problem with Europe is the European leaders seems to be that they cannot back off of their maximalist agenda.
Yeah.
And that is, of course, by definition, a losing strategy. They will simply be caught up in the fact that not just Ukraine, all of the problems that Ukraine is facing in terms of military material, financing, manpower, and political resilience, the willingness to fight, is there in Europe as well, in spades. And it is compounded by the fact that we have dissent within the European Union. And I'm not only talking about Slovakia and Hungary. I'm talking about the occasional dissent on the fringes as well. Remember, Bulgaria out of the blue said, oh, well, if you need airspace, just come through us. Then you don't have to worry. You can get through us and then Serbia, and you'll be in Hungary in no time. When that was a problem. So and Croatia occasionally has made statements. Austria has made statements that there are many policies of the EU that they don't like. So, of course, the EU Commission is in a weak position to maintain unity, because for something that is strategically not important to Europe, which is, I think, the outcome of the Ukraine war. It's important to specific political elites in Europe, but certain political parties and political managers, but not to Europe as a whole. In return, they have to concede to a number of small countries all sorts of tariff concessions and extra money for agriculture and things like that, which they don't have. So this, anyone looking at the domestic politics can see, I think, that they are sacrificing a geostrategic desire that they have, which is not imperative for Europe, for real political clout that they could exert domestically and financially within the European Union. And that just weakens their unity in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, history is littered with ironies, and one of the ironies here is, of course, that the goal of breaking up Russia is now, in all likelihood, causing the breakup of the at least the political unity of the Europeans, if not even the Union itself.
Yeah, I don't think it's a short-term prospect, but in the long term, the lessons of how the Ukrainian war was dealt with will have, I think, significant impacts in European political development.
They backed themselves into such a corner. I mean, calling Hamas the Nazis and Hitler, in bunkers is like, okay, that's one thing because they are a small group and the side that you support has overwhelming might, including nuclear weapons. But making Russia the ultimate evil that cannot stand and must be defeated is such a foolish thing, and that framing is still all over Europe, right? That's what's poisoning the discourse.
And then even beyond that, I mean, that's bad enough. But then, willy-nilly, Europe has to also condemn, even though it doesn't want to, wouldn't be at a tremendous disadvantage doing so, China and any trade partners, any geopolitical partners of Russia. Essentially, Ukraine is, I'm sorry, Europe is shooting itself in the foot repeatedly, and it doesn't take a genius to understand that alternative political parties have an easy time gaining votes on the basic issues that are important to voters, which is asking why are we spending all this money and receiving fewer social services? Why this war is far away from us? Uh, why are we accepting all these refugees and migrants also at our own expense? And why are our consumer goods, which we used to get cheaply thanks to Russian energy, Chinese products, now becoming so expensive? We're getting the worst of all possible deals under this political management. And anyone, and just reversing course on 2 out of 3 of these would be enough, I think, in most countries to become the majority party.
No, I mean, at some point, the Europeans are going to get mad that there are no more feet left to shoot at. It's just the rate of decisions that are self-hurting is absolutely fascinating. And the question to me is really just whether or not the Europeans are successful enough in the propaganda spin to pin all the blame on Russia, and whether the majority of the population is going to keep believing that. But the wave, this tide, is right there. I mean, I cannot see this not leading to massive change toward the right side of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
If the next election cycle.
Anti-establishment. It could be extreme. There could be some odd combinations, like people have mentioned in Germany, between the left and the right. But here's the thing. So to come back to your earlier point, what does Russia need to do to overcome this ability of the European elite to paint it as a frightening monster? It seems to me the answer is fairly simple. It fulfills its military objectives, occupies the territories, holds there, and says, now let's negotiate. Does a full court press after winning its objectives militarily, not anyone else's objectives, the objectives that they actually said they wanted, and stopping there for now, and promising not to go forward, but asking for negotiations, which will be very difficult, I think, for Ukraine to accede to. But at that point, I think it will be extremely difficult for European leaders to argue that the threat is not containable, because Russia is, in fact, doing exactly what it promised. If this is what it does, it will have stopped at the line which it defines as necessary for its own security. It will not be, in the words of European leaders, a just outcome, but it will be a peaceful outcome. And that's something that I think is something that many Europeans will be willing to accept, given the costs, the interminable costs and escalating costs of continuing this fight.
Yeah, I mean, I think you are right, of course, on a rational level, but I do think that you are overestimating the ability of the Europeans to still think rationally. They will find ways to emotionally spin it in a way that it still galvanizes a good core of the electorate. But just one more question, because one of the stated objectives, this to me is the most difficult one. It's not the territory; it's the denazification of Ukraine, because that one is a military objective, but it is one that will not completely depend upon the territory, the immediate territory controlled by Russia, right? So didn't Russia itself also pin itself into a little bit of a corner when it made that one of the key objectives? Because the neutralization, you can neutralize Ukraine by just making sure that you shoot down anything that might help them militarily and so on. You can do that militarily, but denazification you can't.
At the time, when the special military operation was initiated, this was a stated goal. And it gets, from Putin's perspective, to the heart of the problem that Russia has with the Ukrainian political system. And the way they have phrased it, Lavrov phrased it recently in an interview. He said, what we want is for Ukraine to respect the conditions under which it was granted independence, which are enshrined in its Declaration of Independence and in its Constitution, which, he says, are three things: neutrality, not being part of any bloc, so non-alignment, and respect for minorities. So note that denazification, as they've moved away gradually from that terminology, although, to be fair, Lavrov does label the current government as Nazi or as followers of the Nazis. But the alternative terminology that Russia also uses on that point is respect for human rights, respect for minority, or respect for the minority rights of the populations in the East. Oh, well, throughout Ukraine, actually, not just in the East, throughout Ukraine. That's something that would be hard for Europeans to argue against. So how do we get there? How do we get to dealing with this issue? Well, one possible way is at the negotiating table, which Ukraine will be forced to due to its other capacity issues and losses on the military field. What is there left to negotiate? What is left to negotiate is precisely this issue of constitutional guarantees, of minority rights, and neutral status, right? And non-NATO membership. So all of those have been part of the packet that Russia and the Europeans have been negotiating with Ukraine about for the last 10 years. All of them, including the minority rights, because Minsk I and Minsk II also included the component of, at that time for the eastern provinces alone, that minority rights, local rights, as they defined it, had to be respected. So now the issue is to ensure that Ukrainian society as a whole can be made peaceful by mandating the implementation of the full guarantees of its constitution. Because there's actually not much wrong, I don't think, with there's nothing wrong with the Ukrainian constitution. It just needs to be implemented. Remember, Article 10 of the current Ukrainian constitution guarantees the rights of Russian speakers. But subsequent court decisions have gone against the wording of the constitution itself.
Right.
There are ultimately no guarantees for the safeguarding of human rights and minority rights in any country unless the government itself is willing to do so. So a lot of things can be agreed to, documents can be signed, but in the long run, it will have to be a new government that seeks reconciliation between the various communities, Russophone, Ukrainianophone, other minorities within Ukraine. And I think it's in the interests of the Ukrainians themselves and future Ukrainian governments to find an ability to reconcile the country, because without it, it's not only a struggle with Russia that they will have, they will be consumed internally with divisions, just as they have been in the future, just as they have been for the past 30 years. And that too is an important component of this crisis.
Right, right. And a component of the negotiations that will come. Nicolai, thank you very much for that overview. People who want to read more from you, I will direct them in the in the description of this video to your homepage. That's the best place to find your writings, right?
Absolutely. And www.npetro.net.
www.npetro.net. Everybody, please check it out. Nicolai Petro, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.